Welcome back. Tonight, we're venturing into the heart of Africa, where ancient traditions collide with modern reality in ways that will make your blood run cold. We're talking about ghost marriages, actual ceremonies where the living wed the dead. And before you dismiss this as folklore, understand this. These are documented practices, real events that happen to this day across various African communities. In many African cultures, death doesn't end relationships, it transforms them. The Shona people of Zimbabwe, the Nuer of South Sudan, the Kikuyu of Kenya, they all have variations of posthumous marriages. Some are performed to ensure the deceased has companionship in the afterlife. Others are conducted so that the dead can have descendants through their living spouse. But what happens when these sacred traditions go wrong? When the dead become demanding? Tonight, I'm sharing 3 true stories that will make you question everything you think you know about love, death, and the thin veil between worlds. These aren't just ghost stories. These are accounts of real people who discovered that some marriages truly are till death do us part, and sometimes not even then. Chipo had always been the rebellious one in her family. Growing up in a rural village outside Harare, she questioned everything. The old ways, the traditional expectations, the arranged marriages that seemed to trap so many women in her community. At 23, she had big dreams of moving to the city, getting an education, maybe even traveling abroad. Marriage was the furthest thing from her mind. But in Shona culture, some decisions aren't yours to make. Chipo's older brother Tinashe had been the golden child, handsome, intelligent, destined for great things. He was engaged to Rudo, a girl from a wealthy family in the neighboring village. The bride price had been paid, the ceremonies planned, the future mapped out. Then, 3 weeks before the wedding, Tinashe died in a car accident on the road to Harare. The family was devastated, but Rudo's family had a different concern entirely. They had invested heavily in this union, not just financially, but socially. Their daughter's reputation, their family's standing in the community, even their ancestral obligations were all tied to this marriage. Tinashe's death couldn't be allowed to unravel everything. That's when the elders suggested the solution that would change Chipo's life forever, Kuraguza. A posthumous marriage where Chipo would take her brother's place as Rudo's spouse. "It's our way," her grandmother explained, her weathered hands gripping Chipo's shoulders. "Tinashe's spirit needs peace, Rudo's family needs honor, and you. You need to understand that some responsibilities transcend your personal desires." Chipo laughed it off at first. "Marry a dead person? Grandmother, this is 2018, not 1918. I'm not doing this." But her family wasn't laughing. Her father, usually gentle and understanding, became stone-faced. Her mother stopped speaking to her entirely. Even her younger siblings started treating her like a stranger. The pressure mounted for weeks. Village elders visited their home daily, speaking in hushed tones about tradition, obligation, and the consequences of defying the ancestors. Rudo's family, meanwhile, made it clear that refusing the marriage would be seen as an insult that could lead to social and economic ruin for both families. They made it impossible to say no. Chipo later told a local reporter, "Every path forward seemed blocked except the one they wanted me to take." The ceremony took place on a humid December evening. Chipo wore a borrowed white dress that felt like a shroud. Where the groom should have stood, there was only a framed photograph of Tinashe, the same photo that would sit on their marital altar for the rest of her life. She spoke vows to a dead man while his bride stood beside her, equally trapped in this supernatural union. The traditional healer leading the ceremony explained the rules. Chipo would now be spiritually bound to both Tinashe's ghost and Rudo. Any children born from this union would be considered Tinashe's legitimate heirs. The marriage couldn't be dissolved by divorce, only by death. "When you take these vows," the healer warned, eyes gleaming in the candlelight, "you're not just promising the living, you're making a covenant with the dead, and the dead, they don't forget." At first, nothing seemed different. Chipo moved in with Rudo and tried to make the best of an impossible situation. They were both victims of tradition, both struggling to build something normal from something deeply unnatural. They even became friends of sorts, bonding over their shared resentment of the circumstances that brought them together. But then the dream started. Every night Chipo would see Tinashe, not the brother she remembered, laughing, joking, full of life. This version was pale, serious, possessive. He would appear at the foot of her bed, watching her with eyes that seemed to burn with an otherworldly intensity. "You're mine now," he would whisper. "You promised. You can never leave." Chipo would wake up gasping, covered in sweat, but Rudo slept peacefully beside her, never disturbed by these nocturnal visits. It was as if Tinashe was speaking only to her. The dreams became more frequent, more intense. Tinashe began making demands. He wanted specific foods prepared and left on his altar. He wanted certain prayers said at certain times. He wanted Chipo to wear his clothes, to speak in his voice when addressing the family. Slowly, systematically, he was trying to possess not just her life, but her very identity. "He's not resting," the village traditional healer confirmed when Chipo finally sought help. "The marriage has awakened something, but it's not bringing him peace. He's becoming something else, something hungry." The healer's solution was terrifying. Chipo needed to consummate the marriage with Tinashe's spirit to fully bind him to the afterlife. This would require a ritual so dangerous that even the healer seemed reluctant to perform it. "If you do this wrong," she warned, "you won't just be married to a ghost, you'll become one yourself." The ritual took place in the family cemetery at midnight during the new moon. Chipo lay on a makeshift bed beside Tinashe's grave, while the healer chanted in the old language, burning herbs that made the air thick and hallucinogenic. As the smoke swirled around her, Chipo felt something cold settle over her body, a presence both familiar and alien. What happened next, she is never fully described. But those who found her the next morning say she was catatonic, her eyes rolled back, speaking in Tinashe's voice and calling for their mother. It took 3 days for her to return to herself, and when she did, she was changed. "He's quiet now," she said simply, "but he's still there. He'll always be there." Today, Chipo still lives as Tinashe's widow. She never remarried, never had children, never pursued those dreams of education and travel. When asked why, she touches the wedding ring that she's never removed and says, "Some promises can't be broken, even if you want to." But sometimes, late at night, neighbors report seeing 2 figures walking hand in hand through the village, a young woman and a shadowy man who seems to flicker in and out of existence. They say if you look closely, you can see that the woman's feet never quite touch the ground. In the cattle camps of South Sudan, among the Nuer people, marriage isn't just about love, it's about lineage, about ensuring that every man's name continues through his descendants. When a man dies unmarried, his family faces a spiritual crisis that threatens not just their social standing, but their very connection to the ancestral world. Nyamal understood this better than most. As the youngest wife in a polygamous family, she had already fulfilled her duty by bearing 3 sons. When her husband died in tribal conflicts, she expected to live quietly as his widow, respected but left alone. She was wrong. Her brother-in-law Gat Koth had died 2 years earlier, killed in a raid before he could marry the bride that had been chosen for him. According to Nuer tradition, his spirit wandered restlessly, unable to join the ancestors without a wife and children to carry on his name. The family elders decided it was time to correct this spiritual imbalance. "We need you to marry Gatquoth," her father-in-law announced during a family meeting. "His ghost has been appearing to the cattle herders, demanding what was denied to him in life." Nyamal stared at the old man in disbelief. "But I'm already widowed. I've done my duty to this family." "Your duty isn't finished," he replied coldly. "Gatquoth's bride died of fever before they could marry. You're the only unmarried woman in our extended family. The ancestors have spoken." The speaking he referred to was a series of increasingly disturbing incidents in their community. Cattle had been found dead with no apparent cause, always near the shrine where Gatquoth's spear and personal effects were kept. Herders reported seeing a tall figure walking among the animals at night, a man they recognized as Gatquoth but who vanished when approached. Most disturbing of all, children in the village had begun speaking in Gatquoth's voice, demanding to know when his wedding would take place. They would have no memory of these episodes afterward, but the effect on the community was profound. Everyone knew that angry spirits could bring drought, disease, and death. "He's not just restless," the local spiritual leader, a wizened old woman named Niaboth, explained to Nyamal. "He's becoming what we call a hungry ghost, a spirit that feeds on the life force of the living. The only way to appease him is to give him what he wants." The wedding ceremony was unlike anything Nyamal had ever experienced. Where a living groom would stand, they placed Gatquoth's spear, his shield, and a bundle of his clothes arranged to suggest a human form. Nyamal found herself exchanging vows with an assemblage of objects while the entire village watched in tense silence. "Do you take this man's spirit as your husband?" Niaboth asked. "I do," Nyamal whispered, her voice barely audible. As she spoke those words, the wind suddenly died. The air became unnaturally still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Several witnesses later reported feeling an intense cold despite the blazing afternoon sun. But the strangest part came during the traditional dance that follows Nuer weddings. As the drummers played and the women sang, Nyamal began moving in ways that seemed impossible, her body contorting, her feet barely touching the ground, as if she were being guided by invisible hands. She danced with the grace and power of a male warrior, performing steps that women weren't traditionally allowed to know. It was like watching two people in one body, said her cousin, who recorded the event on her phone. Nyamal was there, but something else was dancing through her. The ceremony concluded with Nyamal being led to a specially prepared hut where she would spend her wedding night alone, or so everyone assumed. But the sounds that emerged from that hut throughout the night suggested otherwise. Neighbors reported hearing two distinct voices in conversation, the sound of footsteps that were too heavy to be Nyamal's, and at one point, what sounded like intimate laughter between lovers. In the morning, Nyamal emerged changed. She moved differently, spoke differently, even held her head at an angle that reminded people uncomfortably of Gatkwath. When asked about her wedding night, she smiled mysteriously and said only, "My husband is very pleased with our union." Within weeks, Nyamal announced she was pregnant. In a culture where ghost marriages are common, this isn't unusual. The widow typically conceives with a male relative of the deceased, and the child is considered the ghost's legitimate heir. But Nyamal insisted she had been with no living man. "My husband comes to me," she told the village women, matter-of-factly. "Every night. He's very attentive." The other women exchanged worried glances. Ghost marriages were one thing, but what Nyamal was describing sounded like something else entirely, a sexual relationship with the dead that defied all natural laws. As her pregnancy progressed, Nyamal's behavior became increasingly strange. She would have long conversations with empty air, setting aside food for an invisible companion. She began wearing men's clothing, carrying Gatkwath's weapons, and speaking with an authority that was distinctly masculine. "Sometimes I wasn't sure who I was talking to," her sister-in-law recalled. She would switch mid-sentence from her voice to his. It was like they were sharing the same body. The birth was traumatic. Nyamal labored for 3 days, during which she alternated between her own voice, screaming in pain, and Gatkwath's deeper tones demanding that his son be born safely. When the child finally arrived, he bore an uncanny resemblance to his deceased father, so much so that elders who had known Gatkwath crossed themselves and whispered prayers. But the most disturbing detail came from the traditional midwife who delivered the baby. She swore that during the final moments of labor, she saw two shadows on the wall, one clearly Nyamal's, the other unmistakably male, both moving in perfect synchronization, as if they were occupying the same space. Today, 5 years later, Nyamal continues to live as Gatkwath's wife. She has borne 2 more children, all of whom bear striking resemblances to their dead father. The family prospers, the cattle are healthy, and Gatkwath's spirit appears to be at peace. But Nyamal herself seems to be fading. Each year, she becomes a little more transparent, a little more ethereal, as if the boundary between life and death is slowly dissolving around her. When visitors come to the village, they often ask, "Which woman is Nyamal?" only to be told to look for the one who's there, but not quite there. The living woman who's slowly becoming a ghost herself. "She gave him what he wanted," says Nyaboth, the spiritual leader who performed the ceremony. "But every gift to the dead comes with a price, and sometimes that price is your own existence among the living." The Asante people of Ghana have a saying, "When a tree falls in the forest, its roots remain in the earth." For the Osei family of Kumasi, this wasn't just a proverb, it was a business model that would make international headlines and reveal the darkest side of ghost marriage practices. Kwame Osei seemed like an ordinary businessman. He owned a small import-export company, lived in a modest compound with his extended family, and was known in his neighborhood as a helpful, if private man. What his neighbors didn't know was that Kwame was running what authorities would later describe as a ghost marriage operation, a systematic scheme to marry living women to dead men for profit. The operation came to light when Akosua, a 19-year-old university student from a rural village, managed to escape from the Osei compound and make her way to a local NGO that assisted trafficking victims. Her story was so bizarre that initially no one believed it. "They told me I was married to a dead man named Kojo," she said through tears to the social worker documenting her case. "They said he paid a bride price for me before he died, and now I belong to his ghost. Every night they would lock me in a room with his photograph and tell me I had to be a wife to him. Akasua's ordeal had begun 6 months earlier when her family, struggling with debt, received an unexpected visitor. Kwame Osei arrived in their village in an expensive car, wearing fine clothes and carrying what appeared to be legitimate documents. He explained that his deceased nephew Kojo had seen Akosua at a local market before his death and had instructed his family to pursue her as a bride. According to our traditions, Kwame had told Akasua's parents, "When a man dies with specific marriage intentions, his family must honor those wishes. Kojo left money for a bride price. He chose your daughter." The sum Kwame offered was staggering, more money than Akosua's family had ever seen. He presented what appeared to be legal marriage documents, complete with official stamps and signatures. He even brought along an elderly woman he claimed was a traditional priestess who could verify the spiritual legitimacy of the arrangement. Akasua's parents, overwhelmed by the combination of money, apparent legal authority, and spiritual pressure, agreed to the marriage. They told themselves they were honoring both tradition and their deceased son-in-law's wishes. What they didn't realize was that they were selling their daughter into a nightmare. The Osei compound in Kumasi was larger than it appeared from the street. Behind the main house, accessible only through a hidden passage, was a series of rooms that housed what Kwame called his spiritual wives, young women who had been married to various deceased male relatives and friends of the family. "There were 12 of us when I was there," Akosua later testified to police. "Some had been there for years. They told us we were serving our ghost husbands, but really, we were slaves." The daily routine was rigid and disturbing. Each woman was assigned to a specific deceased man and was required to maintain his room as if he was still alive. They prepared daily meals for their ghost husbands, left out clothes for them, and spoke to their photographs as if carrying on conversations. At night, they were locked in these rooms and told to fulfill their wifely duties to their dead spouses. "They said the ghosts would visit us if we were faithful wives," said Ama, another victim who was eventually rescued. "Sometimes they would drug our food with herbs that made us hallucinate. We would see things, feel things. They convinced us it was our dead husbands coming to us." But the true horror of the operation went beyond psychological manipulation. Kwame and his family were using these women as breeding stock. When the women became pregnant, often after being raped by male family members, the children were claimed as legitimate heirs of the deceased men. These ghost children could then inherit property, receive benefits, and continue family lineages that should have ended with death. It was a fraud operation disguised as traditional practice, explained Inspector Akwazi Mensah, who led the investigation into the Osei family. They were using ghost marriage customs to traffic women, commit sexual assault, and engage in inheritance fraud. The financial aspects of the scheme were sophisticated. The Osei family had convinced multiple wealthy men to leave portions of their estates to fund posthumous marriages. These men, facing terminal illnesses or advanced age, were told that ensuring they had wives and children in the afterlife would secure their spiritual well-being. Some left hundreds of thousands of cedis specifically for this purpose. Kwame would then use this money to purchase brides from poor families, forge marriage documents, and pocket the difference. The women became unpaid laborers in his household while bearing children who could claim inheritance rights to various estates. It was human trafficking wrapped in the language of spiritual obligation. The psychological control mechanisms were as important as the financial ones. The women were isolated from their families, told that leaving would anger their ghost husbands and bring curses upon their relatives. They were fed a steady diet of traditional beliefs mixed with deliberate misinformation designed to make escape seem impossible. "They convinced us that our ghost husbands would follow us wherever we went," Akosua explained. "They said that breaking a spiritual marriage would cause our families to die, our villages to suffer drought, our future children to be born cursed. When you're young and isolated and already confused about what's real, you believe these things." The break in the case came when one of the ghost husbands turned out to be very much alive. Kofi Asare, supposedly deceased for 3 years, walked into a Kumasi police station after hearing that his widow was seeking help from an NGO. He had been living in London and was very much surprised to learn he had a wife and 2 children in Ghana. "I knew nothing about any marriage," Asare told investigators. "My cousin Kwame told my family I had died in a car accident. He even held a funeral for me while I was overseas. I only found out when a friend saw my widow on the news." The subsequent investigation revealed that the Osei family had been operating their ghost marriage scheme for over a decade. They had married more than 30 women to deceased or supposedly deceased men, produced over 50 children, and collected inheritance money from at least 7 different estates. When police raided the compound, they found rooms set up as shrines to dead men, complete with photographs, personal effects, and detailed records of daily offerings. They also found a sophisticated record-keeping system that tracked which women were assigned to which ghosts, pregnancy schedules, and financial projections for inheritance claims. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be genuine supernatural activity in the compound. Multiple officers reported feeling overwhelming cold in certain rooms, hearing voices where no one was present, and experiencing electronic equipment malfunctions that had no technical explanation. "I'm not a superstitious man," said Inspector Mensah, "but there was something very wrong with that place beyond the criminal activity. It felt like they had actually summoned something dark through their fake ceremonies." The Osei family was eventually prosecuted on charges including human trafficking, fraud, sexual assault, and document forgery. Kwame received a 15-year prison sentence, while other family members received shorter terms. The women were freed and provided with counseling and support services. But the case raised uncomfortable questions about the intersection of traditional practices and modern exploitation. How many legitimate ghost marriages might actually be cover for trafficking? How many families have unknowingly sold their daughters into spiritual slavery? "The tragedy is that they corrupted something sacred," said Dr. Nana Akoto, a cultural anthropologist who studied the case. Ghost marriage is a real tradition with deep spiritual meaning for many African communities. But when you commercialize the sacred, when you turn spiritual practice into criminal enterprise, you create something monstrous. Today, several of the women struggle with the psychological aftermath of their experiences. Some report ongoing nightmares about their ghost husbands. Others have difficulty forming relationships with living men. A few insist that their supernatural marriages are still spiritually valid, despite the criminal nature of how they were arranged. "The hardest part," says Akosua, now studying law and working to help other trafficking victims, "is that part of me still believes. They made the fake seem so real, mixed so much truth with lies, that I still sometimes wonder if my ghost husband is real and angry that I left him." The children born from these unions face their own challenges. Legally, they are victims of the trafficking operation. Spiritually, according to traditional beliefs, they may be legitimate heirs of deceased men. Culturally, they exist in a liminal space between the living and the dead, carrying the weight of their parents' trauma and society's confusion about their very existence. These 3 stories, from Zimbabwe, South Sudan, and Ghana, reveal the complex and often dark reality of ghost marriage practices across Africa. While these traditions have deep cultural roots and can serve important spiritual functions, they also create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who would use the sacred to serve profane purposes. The practice of posthumous marriage exists in various forms throughout the continent. In some communities, it's a way to ensure that unmarried men can join their ancestors with proper spiritual status. In others, it provides social protection for women who might otherwise be vulnerable as widows. Among the Luo people of Kenya, ghost marriages can preserve family property rights. For the Igbo of Nigeria, they maintain patrilineal inheritance systems. But as our stories demonstrate, these traditions can also become instruments of control, exploitation, and genuine supernatural horror. When families pressure young women into marriages with the dead, when criminal organizations exploit cultural practices for profit, when the boundary between honoring the ancestors and enslaving the living becomes blurred, the sacred becomes sinister. The psychological impact on those forced into ghost marriages can be devastating and lasting. Dr. Mercy Atuli, a psychiatrist who has worked with several victims, explains, "These women often experience a form of complex trauma that combines elements of sexual abuse, spiritual manipulation, and cultural betrayal. They're not just dealing with what was done to them, they're dealing with confusion about what's real, what's culturally expected, and what's spiritually valid." The children born from these unions face unique challenges. In traditional terms, they may be legitimate heirs with genuine claims to property and status. Legally, they may be victims of trafficking operations. Psychologically, they must navigate the knowledge that their existence stems from relationships between the living and the dead. Modern African societies struggle with how to address these practices. Simply banning ghost marriage would be seen as cultural imperialism by many communities, an attack on deeply held beliefs and important social structures. But allowing them to continue without regulation creates space for exploitation and abuse. Some countries have attempted middle ground approaches. South Africa has developed legal frameworks that recognize traditional marriages while providing protections against forced unions. Kenya has established cultural courts that can adjudicate disputes involving customary practices while ensuring they don't violate constitutional rights. But enforcement remains challenging, particularly in rural areas where traditional authorities hold more sway than government officials. Many ghost marriages occur in remote communities where documentation is sparse and outside oversight is minimal. Family pressure, spiritual beliefs, and economic desperation can combine to create situations where young people have little real choice in their marital fate. The role of traditional healers and spiritual leaders is particularly complex. Many are genuine practitioners who take their responsibilities seriously and work to ensure that ghost marriages serve legitimate spiritual purposes. But others, as we've seen, can become complicit in exploitation, using their spiritual authority to manipulate vulnerable people. The problem isn't the tradition itself, explains Dr. Akoto. The problem is when people exploit the tradition, when they use cultural authority to mask criminal behavior, when they turn sacred practices into systems of oppression. The supernatural elements reported in many ghost marriage cases add another layer of complexity. Even skeptics must grapple with the consistent reports of paranormal activity surrounding these unions. Whether one believes these are genuine spiritual manifestations or the result of psychological suggestion and cultural conditioning, their impact on the participants is undeniably real. Some researchers theorize that the intense emotional and psychological states involved in ghost marriages, the grief, fear, desperation, and spiritual openness, may create conditions conducive to altered states of consciousness or genuine psychic phenomena. Others suggest that the cultural expectation of supernatural contact becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy through psychological mechanisms not yet fully understood. What's clear is that for those involved, the experience of marrying the dead often involves elements that transcend normal reality. Whether this represents genuine contact with spiritual realms or the powerful effects of belief and suggestion on human consciousness, the result is the same. Lives fundamentally altered by encounters with forces beyond ordinary understanding. The economic factors driving many ghost marriages cannot be ignored. In societies where marriage provides economic security, where bride prices can lift families out of poverty, where inheritance systems depend on male lineage, the pressure to participate in posthumous unions can be overwhelming. Addressing these practices effectively requires addressing the underlying economic inequalities that make them attractive to desperate families. Education plays a crucial role as well. Many young people forced into ghost marriages lack knowledge of their legal rights, alternative support systems, or even the basics of how traditional practices should properly function. Comprehensive education about both cultural traditions and modern legal protections can help people make informed decisions about their participation in these practices. The international community faces its own challenges in addressing ghost marriages. Respecting cultural diversity while protecting human rights requires nuanced approaches that avoid both cultural imperialism and moral relativism. Supporting local advocates, funding education programs, and working with traditional authorities to develop ethical guidelines may be more effective than external condemnation or blanket prohibitions. Technology is beginning to play a role as well. Cell phones and internet access are making it harder for families to completely isolate victims of forced ghost marriages. Social media connections can maintain links to the outside world that traditional isolation methods cannot completely sever. But technology can also be used by perpetrators to research potential victims, forge documents, and coordinate criminal operations. The stories we've shared tonight represent just the tip of the iceberg. For every documented case of problematic ghost marriage, there are likely dozens that occur in silence, accepted by communities as normal and proper, endured by victims who have no voice or avenue for complaint. The true scope of both legitimate practice and exploitative abuse remains largely hidden from outside view. Religious factors add another dimension to consider. The spread of Christianity and Islam across Africa has created complex interactions with traditional marriage practices. Some religious leaders condemn ghost marriages as incompatible with monotheistic beliefs. Others find ways to incorporate them into syncretic spiritual systems. Still, others ignore them entirely, creating parallel systems of spiritual authority. The legal systems of African nations are still evolving in their treatment of traditional marriage practices. Constitutional protections for cultural rights often conflict with individual human rights guarantees. Courts must navigate between respecting traditional authority and enforcing modern legal standards. The result is often inconsistent enforcement that depends more on the attitudes of individual officials than on clear legal principles. As these three stories demonstrate, the world of ghost marriages in Africa is far more complex and darker than most outsiders realize. It's a realm where ancient traditions meet modern exploitation, where spiritual beliefs intersect with criminal enterprise, where the sacred and the sinister can become impossible to distinguish. For Chipo in Zimbabwe, still bound to her dead brother's spirit, the marriage continues to shape every aspect of her existence. For Nyamal in South Sudan, the boundaries between life and death have become permanently blurred. For the victims of the Osei family operation in Ghana, the trauma of their supernatural slavery continues to haunt them years after their rescue. These are not just stories about cultural practices or criminal exploitation. They are accounts of human lives fundamentally altered by encounters with forces, whether spiritual, psychological, or social, that most of us can barely comprehend. They remind us that in many parts of the world, the dead are not gone, marriage is not always between the living, and love can become a form of bondage that transcends even death itself. Tonight, as you go to sleep in your comfortable bed, in your normal life where the dead stay buried and marriages are between consenting adults, remember Chipo, Nyamal, and Akosua. Remember that somewhere in Africa, young women are still being wed to ghosts, still bearing children to dead men, still living lives suspended between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll understand why so many Africans still believe that some bonds are stronger than death, some promises can never be broken, and some traditions have a life of their own that refuses to die, no matter how much the modern world might wish them to fade away. After all, in the words of that old Asante proverb, when a tree falls in the forest, its roots remain in the earth, and sometimes those roots run deeper and darker than anyone could ever imagine.